Hi, everybody. Welcome. How's your Dreamforce going so far? Woo! Woo! My name is Kenneth Coe. I'm a lead dev on the Communities Manage team, and today I'd like to talk to you about some of the tools we've built to help you moderate your communities. First things first, please do not make any purchasing decisions based on what you're about to hear, but only based on what is currently available today. You've heard this probably a dozen times, but it's no less true. To start, it's important to note when you have a community that you are outnumbered. There are more people on the internet than that would conspire to sort of bring your community down. But if you want to maintain some level of civility, of quality in the content in your community, you're going to need help. So community moderation is the art of maximizing control over the content of your community while minimizing your effort. Now, the internet is a colorful place, but you have friends. It's possible for you to, today I'd like to talk about how it's possible for you to delegate to members of your community responsibilities. You can deputize members of your community to help you control the content in your community. You can also conscript the members of your community to sort of tag or flag, more specifically, problematic content inside of your community so that it doesn't go unnoticed, so that your moderators can see it and deal with it appropriately. Furthermore, in more recent releases, we've developed tools that let you configure the system to automatically counteract problematic content that comes into your community. These rules are built for speed and scalability. They're highly configurable, and we're going to spend most of the time demoing different kinds of rules and how they can be configured in your community. Afterwards, we'll talk a little bit about what's under the hood, but for the most part, the rules themselves are built kind of elegantly. There's not too much interesting going on there, unless you want to get really deep down into the nitty-gritty. So I'll probably save that for Q&A. Firstly, you're going to have different kinds of people in your community. Now, if you're familiar with communities, you're probably already familiar with 3 different user types. You have your internal users, or your employees. You have your partner users, or employees of other organizations. And you have your customers. And these types are important because they designate what your users are able to see and what they're typically coming to your community for. But in addition to those types, you're going to have a different dimension of types, which dictate not just what your users can see, but what they can do. So myself, as the admin, I would play the role of configuring the community to make sure that a certain level of a certain quality of content arrives. Pretty handsome. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, you can deputize people in your community, not just other employees, but also customers and partners who can go around and deal with problematic content for you. You can make them moderators, you can give them moderator permissions, and they'll be able to use the moderation tools and to delete other people's problematic content. More generally, you're going to have visitors who come to your community who won't necessarily understand the level of discourse you're trying to achieve in your community at the first time. So you will want to handle them more gently. But on the other hand, you may also get spammers coming to your community who would take a more active, malicious role, particularly if your community supports self-registration. Self-registration communities, you can allow customers come in to make meaningful contributions, but other people may just come in to sort of post spammy links to viruses and such. So they must be dealt with a heavier hand. A couple of releases ago, we developed flagging in general. So generally, the flow of how flagging would work is that a user would come and notice problematic content. Here, Nelson Newby has posted something passive-aggressive on Lauren Boyle's well-deserved promotion, and Lauren has chosen to flag it because this is not necessarily something that she wants to see. The flag is not visible generally. It's more of a sort of private signal to your moderators to let them know that problematic content exists. And those moderators can later on go to their tools and decide how to respond to flagged content. They can remove the flag and deem it fine, or they can straight up delete the content. This helps you to make sure that you don't just have random problematic content floating around in your community. You make sure that someone always kind of sees it. Now, while you're crowdsourcing the identification of problematic content, the response is still going to have to be manual. You're still going to have a moderator come along and delete a post if it's, not very good. So what you can do in more recent releases is configure a moderation rule. A moderation rule is simply a construct that lets you configure our system so that when X posts Y, do Z. I'll let that sit for a second while I drink a little. When X posts Y, do Z. Now this minimal additive formulation is, I believe, simple and elegant. You can configure multiple rules in this way, and they can all work together to provide an effective moderation solution. There's no weird edge cases, no weird complications. You just simply define, you tell the system that when X posts Y, you want to do Z to it. And Z can be any number of things. We're back. There are several things you can do. You can either automatically flag things so that if your users don't catch stuff, your rule cannot catch stuff and bring it to the attention of the moderators. Alternatively, you can either configure rules to replace, review, or block content that's coming in. These actions will partially or wholly obfuscate content that comes in if it's deemed problematic by the rule. And lastly, more severely, you can freeze the user out if they're causing problems, if they're posting large volumes of problematic content. Now, these actions are kind of abstract on the board, but I believe that they're easier to understand, and it's easier to understand the versatility of the solution if we walk through the problems that they're trying to solve. So this is going to be a little inelegant, but I'm going to try to start the demo. I'll be switching back and forth between a bunch of users, but with any luck, it'll go well. So say I have a community. Here I have a demo community, Audio Pro. And I want to add some moderation rules to this community. Say I've been having trouble with spam. So if people have been posting, gouts of profanity on my community, I can configure a moderation rule to automatically notify my moderators to let them know that a problem is emerging. So if I go to content criteria and I define a list of obscenities, here we have a list filled with bad words. The first draft of this was a lot more colorful. And we can take this list of bad words and we can configure a rule. So here, I just simply define a new rule so that when anyone posts an obscenity, I want you to flag it. So when you save that rule, and when anyone, myself included, goes into the community and attempts to post some bad word, yeah, I'll just go to the community here. We can see that it becomes flagged. Oh, I clicked the wrong one. We go into the community, post something clever, bad word, words, bad word, whatever. So we see that when we post the bad word, the rule that we configured automatically adds a flag to it. And if we go into the community management console, we can see in our tool that it is that it is visible under the list of flagged posts. Someone's posted something bad, and now our moderators know about it automatically. Don't need to wait for someone to report it. Now, an obscenity would be kind of an obvious choice for flags, but because flags are so subtle, you can also use them to simply identify posts that aren't necessarily objectionable, but you can get very clever with it. So let's say some of our competitors, like we want to know whenever someone posts a link to one of our competitors. What we can do, we go to content criteria and define a list of a couple of competitor names. And we can drop into the rules and define a rule that will automatically flag whenever anybody posts a competitor URL. Now, if I were to go down here and attempt to post a competitor's URL, I have it written down somewhere. It was something clever. It was stratus.net. Have you seen the new stratus.net website? We will see that it is automatically flagged. And people can deal with it how they choose later on. Now, this is all well and good. Now we can identify problematic content, but we still have to have a moderator come in to manually deal with it. What we could do is we could configure a rule to obfuscate the problematic content. If we go to the rules and define a replacement rule for obscenities, whenever anyone posts an obscenity, here we can reuse the list we defined earlier. I want you to replace the text of those bad words with asterisks. So if I remember to enable this, we'll turn on this rule and we will attempt to post some bad words. Bad word, some other bad word. Oh. We'll see that they're automatically censored out, and we'll also see that it also gets flagged. Multiple rules can work in conjunction to help you moderate your community because the context of what they're writing here is still somewhat visible. It's somewhat obfuscated, but it's good to also have the flag, belt and suspenders. I would note that these rules are community specific because your different communities may have different standards of quality that you want to maintain. For example, we also have a partner community. And in this partner community, we may want to still censor out bad words, but we don't necessarily want to flag it because we're not going to necessarily do anything about them. We just want to make sure that those obscenities don't wind up in our database. So what we do is we go to the console for the partner community. We go and we define the same content criteria you saw earlier, a list of bad words. We define a rule similar to the one we saw earlier. Whenever anyone posts an obscenity, we want you to censor it out with asterisks, and we can see that if I attempt to post some bad words, that it will censor them out. Hey. Now, replacement is good because it's explicitly obscuring the part of the post that you don't want to see, but the post is still making it in. Alternatively, if you want to avoid making any of this post visible, you can also define review rules. Now, review rules are interesting. Let's say we have a scenario. Let me find the right community. In a momento. Let's say we have a scenario where the company is currently under talks to do something particularly sensitive. And we want to make sure that that any company communications that go out from representatives of the organization are reviewed before they're made public. So what we can do is we can go to define a list of particularly sensitive topics that we might want to review before people communicate them. And furthermore, we can go to member criteria to define a class of user that we want this rule to run on. Here, because we care primarily about internal and partner users, we have defined a member criteria that captures only internal and partner users. So we go into the rule and we define a rule that checks to see that whenever an internal or partner member posts anything that containing a sensitive product code name, we will put it automatically into review. So if I, as an admin, were to go to the community, the partner community where this rule is defined, and if I were to ask, when is the news about the Twitter position going to go public? We can see that it automatically goes into review. Now, for convenience, I've made the administrator a reviewer, but you can delegate responsibility however you like. So I, as a reviewer, am able to approve my own post. But if we want to separate concerns, you can still make sure you can give that responsibility to other people. Now, it's interesting because this rule only applies to internal members. It doesn't apply to your customers. If I were to go into, say, it's one of these. If I were to go and log into a customer account, say Miss Lauren Boyle is a regular customer. If I were to log into the community as Miss Lauren Boyle, and I were to ask about the Twitter acquisition, the rule would not run on her. When is the news about the Twitter going to go live? Our customers are free to gossip all they like, but the rule only applies to internal users because we hold those internal users to a higher standard. We also have different levels of trust with our internal users. So while we expect both our employees and our partners to comport themselves in a certain way, we would expect that there's a certain, that particularly for, say, new partners, if you hire a large number of new partners, that they might not necessarily know the ropes. They might, we might want to make sure that anything they post into this community is reviewed before it goes live. So what we can do is we can go to the community and we can define a blanket new partner review. So what we'll do is we'll go to the member criteria. I am on number 6, yes. And number 6 will capture new partner members. I will define a member criteria that will capture partners who were created in the last 7 days. And what I'll do is I'll go to the rules, and I'll say whenever a partner posts anything, because I haven't defined any criteria, the criteria is considered fulfilled, I want you to put this into review. So if I save it, this will warn you to let you know that you're doing that. And I log in as, it's not this one, it is this one. And I log in as Nelson Newby, a relatively new partner. I log into the audiobook community and make sure this is alive. And if I were to post really anything, it will fall automatically into review. Let's say I'm new, I'm lost. How do I get out of the customer community? Now, this is not necessarily an objectionable post, but it's certainly not something that you would want to see on your customer community. So fortunately, it's already fallen into review. Paul Partner can come in and see this and deal with it however he likes. He can approve it to make sure that if it's something good, or he can, get rid of it if it's not. One moment while I find my place. Okay. So review is good because it hides the content from people who don't, from the general population of your community. But you're still creating work for your reviewers. It's not automatically preventing that content from getting into your community. So if you want to do that, you can create a block rule. Let's say, hypothetically, that your company recently had a branding change. And we want to make sure that all of our internal employees and all of our partners use the new branding. So we can define a list that contains all of our old branding, serious, yada, yada, yada. And we can define a rule that blocks, that checks for when an internal representative of the company posts some deprecated branding. We want to block that and to let them know that, oh, they should use the new branding. And we can be nice about it. Thank you. Heart. So now if someone attempts to post some, internal something with respect to the internal branding, say here, we all miss the old Napili branding. You can get a warning message telling us to, no, we're not calling it Napili anymore, we're calling it self-service. Now this is a clever example of what you can do to prevent your internal users from posting things, but more commonly what you're going to be doing is you're going to be trying to prevent random strangers on the internet from posting problematic things on your community. So to do that, you can define spam keywords that will capture not just obscenities, but content that's typically associated with spam. So .com.ru, or dermatologists hate him, or even just really anything with an exclamation mark is probably going to be suspect. Now the difficulty of defining a rule with really general terms like this is that you're going to want to let your more trusted users, post today exclamation mark. So fortunately for us, spammers tend to fall into a particular kind of profile. They tend to, especially for self-registered communities, they typically will come in explicitly just to post spam. They'll be relatively new users, so we can create a member criteria that captures users who are customers specifically, who have been created in the last 3 days, or you can also capture customers who have never posted before. So taken together, what we'll do is we'll define a blocking rule that will watch for whenever a new customer or a zombie customer posts a spam keyword or obscenities as well, because we can just throw that in, and it'll tell them that they cannot post it. So let me figure out which one it was. I believe it was this one. Yeah, so test 0 spammer may log into the community. And if this person attempts to post something on, say, Lauren Boyle's profile, come on. Cheap diet pills today, ask me how. You can see that it gets blocked. Now, spammers are intelligent, and they can attempt to post problematic content on your community in various ways. But fortunately, because the system is flexible, you can always go back and modify your content criteria list to add or remove spam keywords, depending on if you have too much or even too little. You can iterate on your rules to make them more effective, to have fewer false positives and fewer false negatives by simply modifying your keyword lists and checking out the audit trail, which tracks the behavior of your rules. You can you can come to, let's see, it is Moscone West 202 tomorrow morning, and Shakti Tas will be doing a talk about various reports like this, which will help you see both not only your rule performance, but also the general behavior and shape of your community. It'll help you to make more informed decisions. It'll help you just more generally. Excuse me. Now, this is good for capturing spam that is of a particular characteristic, but it's important to note that spam is not just like weird sales pitches. It can also be kind of legitimate looking. There are people who can register for your community, salespeople, who will just come in and literally cold call every group or private message every person. And while this is not technically spam, it might not have any of the typical markers of spam, it's still problematic to have this volume of information coming in. So to handle that, if you want to control the volume of content coming in from an individual new user, what you can do is you can define a rate rule, this last one. So all these previous rules were content rules, but this last one is a rate rule. And what it says is that when a new customer posts more than 5 times in the course of 15 minutes, I want you to freeze them out. Now, this is a very severe action, and typically, like we've tied it very specifically, the freeze action, only to run for rate rules, because typically a single post is not enough to disqualify someone from being in a community. It is a pattern of behavior that really should disqualify them. So it's worth noting that the count is, the rate rule is highly performant, but it is also non-deterministic. So there's a very good chance that if I post, if I post 5 times in 15 minutes, that it'll lock me out of the community. But again, it's non-deterministic, it's heuristic. So it'll be approximately 5 or 6 or 7 times. I probably shouldn't be doing this live, but I do kind of want to see the person get frozen out. If it doesn't work, please take my word for it. Yeah, let me just make sure I'm logged in as the right person. How are we doing on time? It's getting a little tight. There we go. We're locked out. Yay. So this is just a sample of the things that it's possible to do with moderation rules. These 9 variations are really just sort of a representative slice of what you can do with moderation rules. Like you could theoretically go HIPAA. I mean, I've seen people be very clever with it. I'd like to return to the presentation to talk a little bit about what's going on under the hood. It is this one. Right, again, these are all just formulations that are combinations of the idea when X posts Y, do Z. I find that's the most effective way to think about it. This is a diagram from our patent filing for how we do this. There is a typical sort of Salesforce flow, a save framework for whenever we save really anything to the database. In this hook, we do validation, we run your workflow, we maintain your consistency. And the rules framework hooks in to several places. Your block rules, one of the most severe ones, will happen during validation. Your replace and pre-moderation rules, pre-moderation is another word for review. Your replace and review rules will run during pre-save, munging the user's data right before it goes into the database. Your flag rules will happen actually right after workflow. This diagram's a little bit wrong, but I'm not going to fault them for that. Furthermore, your apex triggers, the ones that you define, will happen either right before validate or during the post save. It's important to note how they will interact, but in all honesty, it's actually not that interesting because the ideal is that they would interact intuitively. If you have a pre-Apex trigger that modifies the text of a user's post, it will be recognized by the moderation rules framework. Say you had some sort of plugin that will append a signature to every user's post. If that appending signature contains a bad word, the rules will see it. Furthermore, if you actually have a post-Apex trigger, it will also, it'll technically, because even though it happens after everything else, the rules framework will still see it because it initiates another entire save process. It's currently a little bit bugged, but it's definitely going to be fixed in the next release. Where was I? Right, okay, so you can see in this diagram that we have several performance optimizations. Here we have a two-layer caching framework to load and persist the configuration, the rule configuration representation of your automatic moderation. And we have a couple of other things that you really can't do on your own in Apex. Because the moderation framework is built so close to the metal, we can do a lot of, we can and have done a lot of performance optimizations. Scalability and speed was one of our principal drivers during the development of this framework. So the moderation rules won't count against your Apex limits. Your configuration changes don't need to be recompiled into Apex. You don't need to touch any code at all to configure your moderation. And it's frankly just more performant. We've built in, again, as I mentioned, the two-level caching. We have bulkified, fast hashed up token matching, and the rate limiting tracking, as I mentioned earlier, it's a little fuzzy, but it is actually highly performant. And the bottom line behind all these optimizations is that the TP95, that is 95% of the calls that invoke the moderation rules framework, will operate in less than 1 millisecond. The TP99.99 is 100 milliseconds. So you don't even, you should not notice, and you do not notice, that the moderation rules framework actually just works, and it doesn't impact your performance at all. We're still working on it. We're still building out the moderation framework. If X posts to Y, do Z, you can see that even with the rate rule framework, we've been expanding on Y. We've been making it fuzzier. So as part of the Einstein initiative, we've been working on building a little bit of machine learning into our criteria. SpamIQ is the code name we're currently using for our machine learning initiative to automatically and adaptively classify user-posted content as spam based on how you've treated, you and your moderators have treated posts in the past. It's currently in development. We're working with Shakti and the community moderation IQ team to sort of get it out. It may or may not be considered an extension of the moderation rules because, again, moderation rules are pretty deterministic. If X posts Y, do Z. And most of the work left to do is primarily how to make it more intuitive, how to sort of convey that the little black box model makes decisions and how to communicate that to people who manage it. So we'll still see. Bottom line, we just have a ton of rules coming down the framework and in the present product that will help you moderate your community. You are not alone. Our tools will help protect your community for you. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I would like, I guess there's 5 minutes for Q&A, if anyone would like to speak. I'd like to thank you all for listening, coming, and supporting this talk. If you have any questions, My email is kko@salesforce.com. Or if you have any suggestions, you can go to the success community and log an idea under ideas. But I think now would be a good time for questions if anyone has any. You in the back? Yes, we're actually working currently on having out-of-the-box keyword lists set up to capture the most typical cases. I believe there are also partners or also just rules more generally that you can look up. The question was, are there any built-in anti-spam measures? And the answer is we are absolutely working on building some content criteria for you, some starting places that you can build on top of.
Affinity in that same category.
Absolutely. You can find the lists yourself if you're brave, but yeah, more generally, it's all relatively rote. You can capture most cases, but again, you do want to customize your community to your own requirements. If you have a large number of French people in your community, your obscenity list may look a little different from another person's network. Sure, but I mean, you can copy paste into that as well. Sure. Any other questions? All right, I'll give you, I'm sorry?
Connected to that question from the existing list of accessible.
Yeah.
Can you use data to upload it?
Yes, absolutely. Over. Not presently, no. It was on our roadmap, but it was deprioritized because, again, we work primarily with explicit catching. The lists are long, though, so you can build them out if you like.